Welcome to Darkwake Signal. This report begins with a routine U.S. Navy salvage dive in the North Atlantic. The mission was documented, approved, and cleared without incident. The sensor data tells a different story. If you're watching this unfold, hit subscribe, leave a like, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Signal received. Let's dive in. The dive was authorized under Protocol 7 Delta at 0534 hours on November 9th. Weather conditions were logged as acceptable. Sea state moderate. Visibility projected at 15 to 18 feet below 120 feet depth. The objective was documentation and retrieval assessment of material from Grid Sector 41N, approximately 47 nautical miles northeast of the Flemish Cap. Previous sonar sweeps had identified what appeared to be ordnance canisters and structural debris consistent with a 1960s-era disposal site. The Navy had been using that region for controlled munitions disposal between 1961 and 1968, before international protocols prohibited the practice. This was salvage documentation, not recovery. Standard procedure. The kind of work that gets filed, indexed, and forgotten. Chief Diver Eamon Calder-Vale ran the pre-dive briefing at 0545. He had run the same briefing with minor variations approximately 340 times over his career. His delivery was consistent. His checklist was thorough. He did not deviate from approved language. Iver Solstrand Kincaid was assigned as safety diver, standing by topside with a backup rig in case of emergency deployment. He had worked with Vale on 11 previous missions. Their communication pattern was efficient and minimal. Dive Supervisor Harlan Beckett Rowe observed from the operations cabin, monitoring sensor feeds and maintaining the official log. He had signed off on 29 similar missions in the previous 18 months. This one appeared identical to all the others. The descent began at exactly 0600 hours. Vale's suit was a standard issue Mark 21 deep sea hard suit, rated to 1,200 feet. His umbilical carried air, power, heat, and communications. 3 cameras were active, helmet-mounted, chest-mounted, and a handheld unit for close documentation. Biometric sensors transmitted heart rate, respiration, core temperature, and O2 saturation in real time. Surface conditions were stable. Current minimal. Water temperature holding at 43 degrees Fahrenheit. Surface to Vale radio check. Loud and clear. Beginning descent. The depth gauge advanced in steady increments. 50 feet. 80. 110. Vale's breathing rate was 16 respirations per minute. Heart rate 71 beats per minute. Everything within normal parameters for a working dive. At 145 feet, he reported visual contact with the debris field. On station. Initiating survey pattern alpha. The helmet camera feed showed scattered cylindrical shapes half buried in silt. Corrosion patterns consistent with 50-plus years of submersion. Vale began his photographic documentation, moving in a grid pattern, marking GPS coordinates for each item of interest. 4:34 minutes, the operation proceeded exactly as outlined in the mission brief. At 0634 hours and 11 seconds, Rowe noted the first irregularity. Vale confirming your depth reading. You're showing 157 feet. Is that correct? Pause. 2 seconds longer than Vale's usual response time. Affirmative. Depth gauge reads 157. Rowe frowned at his monitor. The surface system showed 162 feet. A 5-foot discrepancy was within acceptable variance. Sensors sometimes disagreed due to pressure calibration differences, but it was unusual for Vale's equipment. His gear had been serviced 11 days prior and tested thoroughly. Copy that. Continue documentation. At 0636:42, the discrepancy increased. Rowe's screen now showed Vale at 168 feet. Vale's suit readout, transmitted via telemetry, showed 154 feet. The numbers were moving in opposite directions. Vale, we're seeing conflicting depth data up here. Run a diagnostic on your gauge. Running diagnostic now. 30 seconds passed. Surface, diagnostic shows green across the board. My reading is stable at 152 feet. But on Ro's display, the number had dropped to 173 feet. Ro leaned forward, checking the backup sensor array. The secondary system confirmed 173 feet. The tertiary system, which operated independently on a separate power source, showed 174 feet. 3 systems agreeing, and all 3 contradicting the diver's own readout. Vale, I need you to halt documentation and hold position. We're troubleshooting something up here. Copy. Holding position. Ro pulled up the comparison overlay, a split screen showing Vale's suit telemetry on the left and the surface array on the right. The heart rate matched. Respiration matched. O2 consumption matched. Core temperature matched. Only depth was diverging, and it was accelerating. At 0638:19, the surface array showed 186 feet. Vale's suit showed 149 feet, a 37-foot discrepancy. Ro reached for the direct line to Kincaid. Get your standby gear ready. We might need you in the water. Kincaid's voice came back immediately, no hesitation. Understood. Suiting up now. Ro returned his attention to the monitor. Vale, we need you to start ascending. Standard rate. Acknowledge. No response. Vale, do you copy? Still nothing. But the biometric data was still transmitting. Heart rate now 78 BPM. Respiration 18 per minute. Slightly elevated but not alarming. The suit's internal systems showed full functionality. Air pressure normal. Power stable. Communications channel open. Just no voice on the other end. Chief Vale, this is Dive Supervisor Ro. Respond immediately. Silence. Ro's hand hovered over the emergency retrieval switch. Protocol dictated immediate ascent if a diver became unresponsive. But the data suggested Vale was fine, conscious, breathing normally, showing no signs of distress. And then the depth reading on the surface array began to descend rapidly. 194 feet. 201 feet. Vale wasn't descending. He was holding position. The umbilical tension gauge confirmed it. No additional line was being deployed. The cable hung at the same angle it had maintained for the past 6 minutes. But according to every sensor on the ship, Vale was sinking. 207 feet. 215. Initiating emergency retrieval, Ro said into the comms, his voice steady despite the cold weight settling in his gut. Kincaid, stand by for deployment. The winch engaged. The umbilical began retracting at the standard ascent rate, 30 feet per minute. Enough to bring a diver up safely without risking decompression injury. But the depth reading continued to increase. 223 feet. 229. Ro stared at the numbers, his mind trying to construct a rational framework. Equipment failure. Multiple simultaneous sensor malfunctions. Electromagnetic interference. Anything that fit within known parameters. But 3 independent systems didn't fail identically. Not like this. At 0641:07, the depth reading reached 240 feet. And then it stopped. Not gradual. Not drifting. It simply froze at 240 feet, the number locked on the screen as if the system had paused. The umbilical was still retracting. The winch was pulling steadily. But the depth gauge didn't move. Ro checked the other biometrics. Heart rate had spiked to 94 BPM. Respiration 22 per minute. Core temperature had dropped half a degree. Vale, if you can hear me, stay calm. We're bringing you up. The helmet camera feed flickered. 4:3 frames, less than 1/10 of a second. The image distorted. Not static, not corruption, but a visual disruption that Ro's brain couldn't immediately process. The debris field was there, and then it wasn't, replaced by something that resembled geometry but didn't follow perspective rules his eyes understood. Then it snapped back to normal. Silt. Wreckage. The faint glow of Vale's work lights. Roe's hand was shaking slightly when he keyed the mic again. Kincaid, are you ready? Affirmative. Standing by. The depth reading suddenly jumped. Not gradually. Instantaneously. From 240 feet to 68 feet in a single refresh of the display. Roe's breath caught. The winch was still pulling at the same rate. The umbilical showed consistent tension. Nothing about the physical retrieval had changed. But according to the sensors, Vale had just ascended 172 feet in under 2 seconds. Visual contact. Kincaid's voice came through. I've got him. He's at 50 feet, ascending normally. Roe's eyes stayed fixed on the depth gauge. It now read 51 feet and was decreasing steadily, matching the retrieval rate, matching what Kincaid was seeing. As if the previous 8 minutes hadn't happened. As if Vale had never been at 240 feet. As if the sensors had simply been reporting something that couldn't exist. At 0644:33, Vale broke the surface. The deck crew swung the recovery crane, and the hard suit was hoisted onto the platform. Through the helmet viewport, Roe could see Vale's face. His eyes were open. He was breathing. He appeared conscious and aware. They released the helmet seal. Vale inhaled the cold November air and blinked slowly, adjusting to the light. Status report, Chief, Roe said, keeping his voice level. Vale's expression was calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that comes after shock has passed but before understanding has arrived. Mission proceeded as planned. Documentation complete. No issues encountered. Roe stared at him. You didn't respond to comms for over 4 minutes. I responded to every transmission. We have a recording that says otherwise. Vale's gaze didn't waver. Then your recording equipment malfunctioned. Kincaid had moved closer, studying Vale with the careful attention of someone who had pulled injured men from the water before. You feeling okay, Chief? Any pain, disorientation, nausea? Negative. I feel fine. But his eyes were wrong. Not medically wrong. The pupils were reactive, the focus sharp, but wrong in a way Roe couldn't articulate. Like Vale was looking at them from slightly farther away than he should be. Get him to medical, Roe ordered. Full workup. I want blood panels, neuro assessment, everything. Vale didn't argue. He stood, moving with his usual controlled precision, and walked toward the medical bay with 2 crew members flanking him. Roe returned to the operations cabin. The mission data was still on the screens, time-stamped and logged. He pulled up the depth chart, a visual graph of Vale's dive profile over time. For the first 34 minutes, it was exactly what he expected. Descent to 162 feet. Flat line indicating working depth. Then the beginning of ascent. But between 0636:42 and 0644:33, the line did something impossible. It dropped below the baseline, below the seafloor. The graph showed Vale descending to 240 feet in a region where the ocean floor was confirmed at 168 feet by 3 separate surveys. According to this data, Vale had spent 7 minutes and 51 seconds below the bottom of the ocean. Roe sat in silence, staring at that line. Then he opened a new window and began reviewing the helmet camera footage frame by frame. Most of it was exactly as expected. Debris, silt, occasional fish. Vale's gloved hands moving through the frame as he worked. But at 0638:22, there was a distortion. It lasted 4 frames. At 30 frames per second, that was roughly 0.13 seconds. In those 4 frames, the image showed something that wasn't the debris field. The geometry was wrong. Angles that couldn't exist in 3-dimensional space. A sense of depth that extended in directions the human eye couldn't follow. And in the center of that impossible space, a shape. Not human, not mechanical. Just a shape that Roe's visual cortex refused to interpret correctly. Every time he tried to focus on it, his eyes slid away, unable to hold the image. And around it, barely visible, were other shapes. Smaller, human-sized, suspended in that space like specimens in formaldehyde. Roe paused the playback. He leaned closer to the screen, trying to force his eyes to resolve the details. One of the shapes was wearing what looked like a diving suit. An old one, design consistent with equipment used in the 1970s. The advanced one frame. Another shape. This one in what appeared to be a Navy uniform. The cut and style suggested 1980s issue. One more frame. A third figure. Modern dive gear. Recent enough that it could have been issued last year. And all of them were facing the camera. Roe closed the window. His hand was steady when he reached for the incident report form, but his pulse was not. The medical examination took 41 minutes. Dr. Lydia Marsh had been with the salvage unit for 6 years. She had treated decompression sickness, hypothermia, nitrogen narcosis, and psychological breaks brought on by extended isolation. She knew what a diver looked like after a bad experience underwater. Bill didn't look like that. He sat on the examination table, answering her questions with the same measured calm he'd shown on deck. His responses were appropriate. His pupils reacted normally to light. His reflexes were within standard ranges. Blood pressure, heart rate, temperature, all nominal. But when she asked him to describe what he'd seen during the dive, his answer came 3 seconds late. Not hesitation. Not confusion. Just a pause, as if he were listening to something before speaking. Debris field consistent with historical disposal records. Cylindrical containers, various stages of corrosion. Minimal marine growth due to depth and temperature. Did you experience any unusual sensations? Vertigo, auditory hallucinations, visual disturbances? Another pause. Negative. Marsh made a notation. You didn't respond to communications for approximately 4 minutes. Do you remember that period? I responded to all communications. The recording suggests otherwise. Vale's expression didn't change. Then the recording is incomplete. She finished her examination and cleared him for light duty, pending a follow-up in 48 hours. But she pulled Roe aside before Vale left the medical bay. Physically, he's fine, she said quietly. But there's something off about his effect. His response timing is inconsistent. He's answering questions correctly, but it's like he's translating them first. Translating from what? I don't know. But I want him under observation. No solo work, no isolation, and absolutely no diving until we understand what happened down there. Roe nodded. Agreed. He returned to the operations cabin where Kincaid was waiting. The safety diver had reviewed the dive footage and the sensor logs. He stood with his arms crossed, staring at the frozen frame showing that impossible geometry. I want to go on record, Kincaid said without preamble, as requesting reassignment from active dive operations. Roe looked at him. Kincaid had been diving for 14 years. He'd worked oil rigs in the North Sea, salvage operations in the Arctic, deep water cable repair in conditions that would ground most teams. He didn't rattle easily. You think it's that serious? I think we don't know what that is. Kincaid gestured at the screen. And I think Vale was somewhere we don't have charts for. It could be equipment malfunction. All 3 depth systems failed identically? Camera distortion occurred at the exact moment the depth readings went impossible? And Vale comes back with no memory of being non-responsive. Kincaid shook his head. That's not malfunction. That's something else. Roe didn't argue. He'd been constructing the same argument in his own mind and failing to make it convincing. I'll note your request, he said. But I need you available for consultation while we investigate this. As long as I don't go in the water at that location, I'll help however I can. After Kincaid left, Rowe pulled the historical records for Grid Sector 41N. The Navy had conducted 17 documented disposal operations in that region between 1961 and 1968. Mostly conventional ordnance, artillery shells, damaged munitions, material deemed too unstable for land-based storage. But there had been other operations, classified ones. Logs referenced materials requiring deep water isolation, without specifying what those materials were. 3 previous survey dives had been conducted in the sector. One in 1983, one in 1997, one in 2011. All had been completed without incident. All had reported standard debris consistent with known disposal operations. Rowe opened the 2011 dive report. The mission summary was brief. 2 divers, standard documentation protocol, no anomalies noted. The report was signed by the dive supervisor and filed without additional comment. But attached to the file was a single-page addendum, dated 3 weeks after the dive. It was a medical note. One of the divers from that mission, Petty Officer First Class Martin Sykes, had requested psychological evaluation following recurring nightmares. The nightmares involved being underwater in a space that didn't follow normal directions. The evaluation concluded that Sykes was experiencing standard post-dive anxiety exacerbated by isolation. He was prescribed rest and reassignment to non-diving duties. There was no follow-up report. Rowe searched the personnel database for Sykes. The record showed he'd been honorably discharged in 2013. Current status, civilian. Last known address, Portland, Maine. Rowe made a note of the name, then closed the file. He spent the next hour reviewing the footage again, isolating each frame where the distortion occurred. There were 11 instances total, scattered across the 7-minute 51-second window when Vail's depth readings had gone impossible. In each instance, the distortion lasted less than half a second. In each instance, the impossible geometry appeared, those angles that shouldn't exist, that space that extended in too many directions. And in 6 of the instances he could see figures, always in diving equipment, always facing the camera, always motionless. In the clearest frame he could make out details on one of the suits, a manufacturer's logo that matched equipment issued in 1979, a helmet design that hadn't been used since the early 1980s. The figure inside the suit was too far away to identify, but Rowe could see the general shape. Human proportions. Arms, legs, torso. But the posture was wrong. The limbs hung at angles that suggested the joints weren't bearing weight. Like the figure was suspended, not standing. Like it had been there a long time. Rowe closed the footage and opened the incident report form. The form had designated fields: mission ID, personnel involved, nature of incident, equipment status, injuries sustained, corrective actions recommended. He filled in the first 3 fields easily enough. When he reached nature of incident, his fingers hovered over the keyboard. What had actually happened? A diver had descended to document debris. Sensors had reported impossible depth readings. Communications had been lost briefly. The diver had been recovered safely with no apparent injuries. Rowe typed, telemetry malfunction resulting in erroneous depth data and temporary communications disruption. Diver recovered without injury. Equipment flagged for diagnostic review. It was accurate. It was incomplete. And it would satisfy the review board. He moved to corrective actions recommended. His first instinct was to recommend suspending operations in Grid Sector 41N pending further investigation. But that would require justification. It would require him to explain why 3 independent sensor systems had simultaneously reported data that violated known physics. It would require him to submit the footage showing that impossible geometry. And if he did that, the investigation would expand. More personnel would be involved. More questions would be asked. The footage would be analyzed by people who might reach conclusions that Rowe himself wasn't ready to reach. He typed, Full diagnostic review of dive telemetry systems. Recommend equipment recalibration before next operation. Then he saved the report and flagged it for supervisory review. It would be read, approved, and filed. Vail would be cleared for duty after his observation period. The equipment would be checked, found to be functioning normally, and returned to service. And the incident would become one more entry in a database of minor technical anomalies that occasionally occurred during complex operations. Rowe closed the file. His hand moved to the footage window, hovering over the delete function. He could erase the frames showing the distortion. Claim they were corrupted data. No one would question it. Equipment malfunctions produced corrupted data all the time. But he didn't press delete. Instead, he copied the footage to a secure drive, encrypted it, and locked it in his personal storage locker. Then he erased it from the main system and logged the deletion as corrupted data removed from mission record. The official record would show a minor equipment issue, a brief communications problem. A diver safely recovered. It wouldn't show the 7 minutes and 51 seconds when Vail had been somewhere that didn't exist on any depth chart. It wouldn't show the figures suspended in that impossible space. And it wouldn't show the frame Rowe had isolated just before erasing the footage, the clearest image of one of those figures, close enough that he could see through the helmet viewport, close enough to see the face inside, close enough to recognize it. The face belonged to Lieutenant Commander Richard Ahmes, who had disappeared during a dive in this same sector in 1979. His body had never been recovered. The official record stated he had likely been swept away by unexpected current and lost at sea. But in that frozen frame, Ahmes was staring directly at the camera, his expression slack and empty, his eyes open but unfocused. And behind him, barely visible in the darkness of that impossible geometry, were dozens more figures, all in diving suits from different eras, all motionless, all watching. Rowe had deleted that frame along with the others. He told himself it was to protect the integrity of the investigation, to prevent panic, to ensure that decisions were made based on verifiable data rather than images that could be interpreted 100 different ways. But when he left the operations cabin that evening, he made sure the door was locked behind him. And when he passed Vail in the corridor, he avoided making eye contact. Because Vail had been in that space for 7 minutes and 51 seconds. And Rowe didn't know what had been there with him, or what might have come back. Vail was assigned to equipment maintenance for the next 48 hours. Light duty, no responsibility for mission-critical systems, and constant proximity to other crew members. He performed his tasks efficiently and without complaint. But the other crew members began to avoid him. It wasn't obvious at first. Just small adjustments. Someone would enter the equipment bay, see Vail working, and remember they needed to check something elsewhere. Conversations would pause when he approached, then resume after he passed. No one could articulate why. When pressed, they offered vague explanations. You seemed fine. You seemed normal. There was just something about the way he moved now, or the way he looked at you when you spoke to him, or the way he stood too still when he thought no one was watching. Marsh conducted the follow-up examination on schedule. Vail's results remained within normal parameters. She cleared him for full duty with a notation that he showed no signs of physical or psychological trauma. But in her private log, the one she kept separate from official medical records, she wrote, "Patient exhibits behavior consistent with normal function, but effect remains flat. Recommend continued observation, though I cannot identify specific medical justification." On the third day after the incident, Rowe received authorization to resume operations in Grid Sector 41N. The equipment had been inspected. The telemetry systems had been recalibrated. The technical review had concluded that the depth sensor malfunction was likely caused by a transient electromagnetic anomaly, possibly from residual charge in nearby metallic debris. It was a plausible explanation. It accounted for the data. It closed the incident report. Rowe filed the authorization without acting on it. Instead, he requested a transfer of operational focus to Grid Sector 38M, citing more accessible targets and better weather windows. The request was approved without question. The Pacific Ranger moved to new coordinates, and Grid Sector 41N was removed from the active mission queue. Vail didn't ask why. He continued his duties, working with the same efficiency he'd always shown, speaking when spoken to, following orders precisely. But he stopped volunteering for dive assignments. And when the crew conducted operations at the new location, Vail would stand at the rail, staring down into the water with an expression that might have been longing or might have been something else entirely. Kincaid noticed. He wants to go back down. Rowe didn't ask how Kincaid knew. He's not cleared for diving. Did he request to be cleared? No. They watched Vail from a distance. He stood motionless, one hand on the rail, eyes fixed on the dark water below. How long are you going to keep him topside? Kincaid asked. As long as I can justify it. And when you can't? Rowe didn't answer, because he didn't know what would happen if Vail went back in the water. He didn't know if Vail would come back the same way twice, or if he would come back at all. The operational tempo resumed within a week. Grid Sector 38M yielded the expected results. Debris consistent with known disposal patterns. Documentation proceeded without incident. Dive teams rotated through their assignments in accordance with standard schedules. Vail remained on the active roster, but his name stopped appearing in dive assignments. There was no formal order. No medical restriction on file. His certifications remained current. His equipment qualifications were valid. He simply wasn't selected. When the rotation schedule was posted each week, Vail would review it without comment. He never requested assignment. He never asked why his name had been omitted. He continued working equipment maintenance, inventory management, and surface operations support. His performance evaluations remained satisfactory. His interactions with crew members were professional and appropriate. But personnel began requesting transfers. The requests were spaced across several months. Different crew members, different stated reasons. Career advancement opportunities. Family considerations. Desire for shore duty after extended rotation. None of them mentioned Vail. But Rowe noticed that the requests came exclusively from personnel who had been present during the incident in Grid Sector 41N. By March, 6 crew members had rotated off the Pacific Ranger. Kincaid was among them. His transfer request cited interest in returning to commercial diving operations. It was approved without delay. He departed with minimal ceremony, shaking hands with the remaining crew, collecting his gear, and boarding the transport without looking back at the water. Rowe spoke with him briefly before he left. You staying away from deep salvage work? Kincaid adjusted the strap on his duffel. I'm staying away from government contracts. Private sector pays better anyway. That's not why I'm going. They stood in silence for a moment. If you're asked about the incident, Rowe began. I won't be asked, Kincaid interrupted. It's filed as equipment malfunction. There's nothing to ask about. But if you are, Kincaid met his eyes. I'll tell them the sensors malfunctioned. Because that's what the report says. And the report is what happened. He left without saying goodbye to Vail. Dr. Marsh continued monitoring Vail through routine examinations. Her medical logs documented normal results across all standard metrics. Blood chemistry unchanged. Neurological function within expected parameters. No complaints of pain, disorientation, or unusual symptoms. But she began noting his resting heart rate. It had always been on the lower end of normal, typical for someone with his cardiovascular conditioning. But over the course of several months, it decreased further. In November, his resting heart rate had averaged 64 beats per minute. By February, it was 58. By May, it was 54. Still within the range considered healthy for an athletic individual. Still nothing that would trigger medical intervention. But the decline was consistent and measurable. Marsh made notations in her private log but didn't include the observations in her official reports. There was no diagnostic justification, no symptoms, no impairment, just a pattern that suggested Vale's body was gradually requiring less oxygen than it had before. In April, the Pacific Ranger was assigned a new salvage objective in Grid Sector 29K, approximately 140 nautical miles south of the original incident location. The mission brief was standard: documentation and assessment of a suspected debris field. Estimated depth 180 to 190 feet. When Rowe reviewed the coordinates, he spent several minutes studying the charts. The location was not in Grid Sector 41N. The geological features were different. The historical records showed no connection to the previous site. But the depth parameters were identical. He modified the mission plan. Maximum operational depth was set at 165 feet. The adjustment was logged as a precautionary measure due to equipment recalibration schedules. No one questioned it. The mission proceeded without incident. But when the dive team returned from the 29K operation, one of the divers, a specialist named Gorman who had not been present during the November incident, mentioned during debriefing that his depth gauge had acted strange for approximately 30 seconds. Rowe asked him to clarify. It jumped around, Gorman said. Showed me at 170, then 162, then back to 168. Settled down after that. Figured it was a sensor glitch. Did you report it during the dive? Negative. It corrected itself and my backup gauge was reading steady. Didn't seem worth breaking radio discipline. Rowe made a note in the mission log. Depth sensor anomaly reported post-dive. Equipment flagged for diagnostic review. The equipment was inspected and found to be functioning correctly. Gorman was scheduled for a routine medical check. Results were normal. His name appeared on dive assignments for the next 3 months without issue. Then, in July, Gorman requested transfer to a training facility in San Diego. His stated reason was interest in instructor certification. The request was approved. By summer, the Pacific Rangers' operational area had shifted primarily to shallower sites. Missions rarely exceeded 150 feet. When deeper targets were identified, they were flagged for future assessment and removed from the active queue. The shift was gradual enough that it didn't appear intentional. Weather windows were cited. Equipment availability. Personnel rotation schedules. Priorities from higher command levels. None of the justifications were false. But Grid Sector 41N remained on the charts, marked with standard notations indicating known debris, no active operations planned. In June, a research vessel from a civilian oceanographic institute requested permission to survey the area. The request was forwarded through standard channels. It was denied. The stated reason was potential interference with future military operations. No timeline for those operations was provided. Vale's behavior showed no dramatic changes. He continued reporting for duty. He maintained his equipment certifications through simulator training and shore-based drills. He participated in briefings and contributed to mission planning when his input was requested. But he stopped eating in the common mess. He began taking his meals in his quarters or alone on deck during off hours. When asked, he offered no explanation. There was no regulation requiring communal dining. His choice was noted but not challenged. Crew members who passed his quarters at night reported that his light was often on at irregular hours. One crew member, a maintenance technician named Orozco, mentioned to Rowe that he'd seen Vale standing on the aft deck at 0300 hours, looking down into the water. Was he doing anything? Rowe asked. Just standing there. Didn't move the whole time I was watching. Maybe 5 minutes. Did you speak to him? No, sir. Didn't seem like he wanted company. Rowe filed the information without taking action. There was no regulation against standing on deck during off hours. In August, Dr. Marsh submitted a request for Vail to undergo a comprehensive psychological evaluation at a land-based facility. The request was not based on any single incident or observable impairment. Her justification cited the cumulative stress of extended deployment and the value of preventive mental health assessment. The request was reviewed by the Medical Oversight Board. It was denied. The board's response noted that Vail's most recent psychological screening had shown no indicators requiring intervention. Routine evaluations would continue on the standard schedule. Marsh did not resubmit the request. But in her private log, she wrote, "Patient continues to function within normal parameters. All measurable indicators remain stable. Recommend monitoring continue indefinitely." She underlined the word indefinitely twice. By September, 8 of the 12 crew members who had been present during the November incident had transferred to other assignments. The turnover rate was elevated compared to historical averages for the Pacific Ranger, but not outside the range of normal variation. Personnel rotation was expected in naval operations. Career development required movement between postings. The pattern was noted in administrative reviews but not flagged as unusual. Rowe remained as dive supervisor. Vail remained on the crew roster. The two of them rarely spoke directly. When mission planning required Vail's input, the exchanges were brief and procedural. Vail's responses were appropriate and technically sound. He offered no observations beyond what was requested. But Rowe noticed that Vail no longer watched the other divers suit up before missions. He used to observe every preparation, checking seals and connections out of habit even when it wasn't his responsibility. Now he stayed in the equipment bay or on the opposite side of the deck until the divers were in the water. Rowe didn't ask why. In October, nearly 1 year after the incident, the Pacific Ranger was scheduled for a maintenance cycle. The vessel returned to port for a 3-week overhaul. Most of the crew was granted leave. Non-essential personnel were reassigned to temporary duties. Vail remained on board. He volunteered for the skeleton crew that maintained security and assisted with the shipyard work. His request was approved without comment. During the maintenance period, Rowe traveled to Portland, Maine. He had filed the trip as personal leave. There was no official justification required. He located Martin Sykes, the diver from the 2011 operation who had reported nightmares about spaces that didn't follow normal directions. Sykes was working as a marine equipment supplier, running a small shop near the waterfront. He was 47 years old, in good health, and had not been diving since his discharge. Rowe approached him under the pretense of seeking advice on equipment vendors. They spoke for 20 minutes before Rowe mentioned the Navy. Sykes' expression didn't change, but his answers became more cautious. Rowe asked if he remembered his last dive in Grid Sector 41N. Sykes set down the equipment catalog he'd been holding. "I remember it was routine work," he said. "Standard documentation. No problems. The medical note said you had nightmares afterward. I had some adjustment issues after discharge. That's common." The note mentioned spaces that didn't follow normal directions. Sykes looked at him for a long moment. "I don't remember saying that. It's in your medical file. Then the file is wrong or I was stressed and said something I didn't mean." Sykes' voice remained level. I completed the mission, I came home. That's all that happened." Rowe thanked him for his time and left. He didn't mention the visit in any official report. The Pacific Ranger returned to active duty in November. Vail was assigned to a new role, Operations Documentation Specialist. The position involved maintaining mission records, managing archived footage, and preparing reports for higher command review. It was a desk assignment. No diving. No direct involvement with underwater operations. Vale accepted the reassignment without comment. His performance in the new role was efficient and thorough. He processed mission data with the same methodical precision he'd brought to diving. His documentation was detailed and accurate. But Rowe noticed that Vale no longer reviewed the helmet camera footage. Previously, he had often watched mission recordings to assess technique and identify areas for procedural improvement. Now he processed the files without viewing them, relying solely on sensor logs and written reports. When asked about the change during a routine supervisor meeting, Vale said he found the sensor data more reliable than visual observation. The explanation was accepted. In December, Grid Sector 41N was formally reclassified. The designation changed from Active Survey Area to Historical Interest Zone. Documentation complete. The reclassification appeared in a routine update to operational maps. No announcement was made. No briefing was held. The area simply moved from one category to another in the administrative database. Future missions would not be planned there unless specifically justified by new intelligence or command priority. No such justification was anticipated. Dr. Marsh retired in January, 2 months earlier than her originally scheduled separation date. She cited personal reasons. Her replacement, Dr. Benjamin Feld, reviewed the medical files for all crew members as part of his onboarding process. He noted no irregularities in Vale's record. When Marsh met with Feld for the transition briefing, she spent extra time discussing Vale's file. "Is there something specific I should monitor?" Feld asked. Marsh hesitated. "Just maintain the regular examination schedule," she said finally. "And if you notice anything unusual, document it." "Unusual how?" "You'll know if you see it." Feld made a note but didn't press further. After Marsh left, he reviewed Vale's file again and found nothing that would justify special attention. Vale's resting heart rate was noted as 52 beats per minute, low, but within acceptable range for an individual with his conditioning. By spring, Vale had been removed from the active dive roster entirely. The removal wasn't formalized through any single decision. His certifications simply weren't renewed when they came due. The expiration dates passed without action. Vale didn't request recertification. When the administrative system flagged his lapsed credentials during a routine audit, Rowe approved a personnel status update that shifted Vale to permanent surface operations. No explanation was required. Vale continued his work in documentation and mission support. He reported for duty on schedule. He maintained professional relationships with the crew. He fulfilled his responsibilities without error. But he stopped going on deck during off hours. The crew members who had occasionally seen him standing at the rail, looking down into the dark water, no longer saw him there. He remained inside, in his quarters or in the operations office, away from windows, away from the ocean. In May, a new dive team was assigned to the Pacific Ranger. None of them had been present during the incident in Grid Sector 41N. When they reviewed the operational history of the vessel, they found standard mission logs documenting routine salvage work. Equipment malfunctions were noted with appropriate frequency. Personnel transfers were listed with their stated justifications. Nothing suggested any break in normal operations. One of the new divers asked Rowe about Vale during a briefing. "I saw he's been with the unit for a while but doesn't dive anymore." "Injury?" "Administrative reassignment," Rowe said. "We needed someone with his experience in documentation." "Makes sense." The conversation ended there. Rowe's own transfer orders arrived in June. He was being reassigned to a training command in Norfolk. The position was a promotion, senior instructor for advanced dive operations. It was the kind of assignment that typically marked the final phase of a career. A role where experience was valued more than physical capability. Rowe accepted without requesting a delay. During his final week on the Pacific Ranger, he conducted turnover briefings with his replacement, Commander Alan Voss. They reviewed operational procedures, equipment inventories, personnel files, and mission histories. When they reached the archived records for Grid Sector 41N, Voss asked if there were any planned operations in that area. None scheduled, Rose said. Any reason why? Other priorities. More accessible targets. Voss made a note and moved on to the next section of the briefing. On his last day, Rowe walked through the ship one final time. He found Vale in the operations office, processing footage from a recent survey dive. "I'm transferring tomorrow," Rowe said. Vale looked up from his screen. "Congratulations on the promotion." "Thank you." They stood in silence for a moment. Rowe had prepared several things he might say, questions he might ask, observations he might share. He said none of them. Instead, he said, "Your work here has been valuable." "Thank you, sir." Vale returned his attention to the screen. Rowe left the office and didn't look back. Commander Voss assumed supervisory responsibilities the following week. The Pacific Ranger continued operations under her command. Missions were planned and executed according to standard protocols. The crew rotated through assignments. Equipment was maintained. Reports were filed. Vale remained in his documentation role. His resting heart rate, recorded during a routine examination in August, was 49 beats per minute. Dr. Feld noted it in Vale's file but took no action. It was still within the range considered normal for an exceptionally well-conditioned individual. In September, 2 years after the incident, the encrypted drive that Rowe had locked in his personal storage locker was discovered during a routine security audit. The drive was logged as unidentified personal media and forwarded to Rowe's current duty station for verification. Rowe confirmed that it contained personal files and requested its return. The request was approved without the drive being examined. When it arrived, Rowe placed it in his desk drawer at his Norfolk office. He didn't open it. 3 months later, during a base-wide electronics disposal initiative, he added the drive to a batch of obsolete storage media being sent for secure destruction. The drive was shredded along with several hundred other devices. No record was made of its contents. Grid Sector 41N appeared on navigational charts used by commercial and research vessels. It was marked with standard notations indicating known debris and recommended transit caution. No restrictions were listed. Several civilian operations passed through the area over the following years. None reported unusual findings. The sector remained classified as historical interest, documentation complete. Vale continued serving on the Pacific Ranger. His assignments remained consistent. His performance remained satisfactory. His medical examinations continued to show results within acceptable parameters. In his third year following the incident, his resting heart rate was recorded at 47 beats per minute. The measurement was noted in his file. No follow-up action was recommended.